World Empires Series Part 13, World War I, The Russian Revolution and the Interwar Years Chapters, 87-94, 1914, 1939. Introduction. We have arrived at the 20th century. The world we are entering is recognizably modern. It has railways, telegraphs, telephones, motor cars and aircraft. It has mass literacy, mass media and mass politics. It also has the most lethal military technology in human history. And in August 1914, the great powers of Europe, through a combination of rigid alliance systems, military timetables and catastrophic diplomatic failure, unleash all of it on each other. Chapter 87, World War I, Trench Warfare and Total War. The First World War was supposed to be short. Over by Christmas, the British volunteers told each other in August 1914. The German Schlieffen Plan was designed for a rapid victory in the West before turning to face Russia. But within months of the opening campaign, the war had settled into something nobody had anticipated or planned for, the stalemate of the trenches. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, two armies faced each other across a strip of devastated ground, perhaps a few hundred yards wide. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery had rendered frontal attacks suicidal, yet the generals of both sides continued to order them with numbing regularity. On 1 July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties, killed or wounded, before midday. It was the worst single day in British military history. New weapons extended the horror. Poison gas was first used by Germany in 1915 at Ypres, spreading burning chlorine across the trenches. Tanks appeared for the first time in 1916. Aircraft evolved from reconnaissance platforms to fighters and bombers within 2 years. Submarines menaced shipping lanes, bringing Britain within weeks of starvation in 1917. The war consumed not just soldiers but entire economies. Women entered factories in their millions. Food was rationed. National debt soared. The concept of total war, in which the entire productive capacity of a nation is mobilized for military purposes, was being invented in real time. The United States entered the war in April 1917, pushed by Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, Germany's proposal that Mexico ally itself with Germany against the USA. Fresh American troops and vast material resources tipped the balance. In November 1918, with the German army no longer capable of offensive action and revolution threatening at home, Germany requested an armistice. At 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns fell silent. 20 million people were dead. 21 million were wounded. 4 empires had collapsed: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian. The world that had gone into the war would not emerge from it. Chapter 88. The Russian Revolution. Russia entered the war in 1914 with the largest army in the world and the most inadequate logistical system. By 1917, after 3 years of catastrophic defeats, the Russian army had suffered somewhere between 5 and 7 million casualties. The Tsar's government could not feed the cities. Bread queues stretched for blocks in Petrograd. In February 1917, soldiers ordered to fire on demonstrators refused. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government of liberals and moderate socialists took power and made the fatal decision to continue the war. Into this instability stepped Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the Bolshevik leader exiled in Switzerland, was transported to Russia in a sealed train by Germany, which hoped he would destabilize the government. Germany's gamble worked. Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917 and immediately demanded peace, land for the peasants and Soviet power. His April theses were a direct challenge to everything the provisional government stood for. In October 1917, in a coup that lasted a night, Bolshevik Red Guards seized the key points of Petrograd. The provisional government dissolved without significant resistance. Lenin proclaimed Soviet power. John Reed, the American journalist who witnessed it, called his account 10 days that shook the world. He was not exaggerating. The civil war that followed was a horror of a different kind. the Red Army against the White Army, foreign intervention, famine, epidemic, and the systematic use of terror by both sides. The Tsar and his family were shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg in July 1918. By 1922, when the Soviet Union was formally proclaimed, Russia had lost perhaps 12 million people since 1914 to war, famine, disease, and political violence. Chapter 89, the Treaty of Versailles. The peace conference at Paris in 1919 brought together the leaders of the victorious powers, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy, to determine the post-war settlement. What they produced satisfied nobody and sowed the seeds of the next war. The German delegation was not invited to negotiate. They were presented with a treaty and told to sign it. The central element was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. This was the legal foundation for all the reparations that followed, 132 billion gold marks, a sum economists immediately recognized as either unpayable or catastrophically destabilizing if forced. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The German military was limited to 100,000 men. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismembered into successor states. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned. Wilson had come with 14 points, a program for a just peace based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Most of his points were either ignored or implemented in ways that contradicted their stated principles. Germans who had heard Wilson's idealistic language and expected a peace without victors felt betrayed. The German right called it a stab in the back, a lie but a powerful one. Marshal Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, heard the terms and said, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. He was almost exactly right. The Second World War began 20 years and 65 days after the Versailles Treaty was signed. Chapters 90 and 91, Weimar and the Great Depression. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, was born in defeat, revolution, and the shadow of a punitive peace settlement. Its first years were chaotic: political assassinations, communist uprisings, right-wing coups, and hyperinflation so extreme that by 1923, it took a wheelbarrow of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. The middle class, whose savings were wiped out, never forgave the Republic. A brief period of stability followed, funded by American loans under the Dawes Plan. The mid-1920s saw genuine cultural flowering, the Bauhaus, Bertolt Brecht, Fritz Lang's metropolis. But the stability was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed. American banks called in their German loans. Credit dried up. Unemployment in Germany reached 6 million by 1932. The Weimar Republic, which had never been loved, was now failing its most basic test, keeping people fed. The Great Depression was global in its impact and catastrophic in its political consequences. In the United States, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal represented an unprecedented expansion of government intervention in the economy, a pragmatic response that saved American democracy. Elsewhere, the Depression strengthened authoritarian movements: Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, the military in Japan. Chapters 92 and 93, the rise of fascism and the Spanish Civil War. Fascism was a new kind of politics for a new kind of mass society. It combined ultranationalism with a cult of violence, contempt for liberal democracy, hatred of Marxism, and the glorification of the leader as the embodiment of the national will. Mussolini coined the term. Hitler perfected the politics. Hitler's rise was technically democratic. The Nazi Party went from 2% of the vote in 1928 to 37% in 1932. He was appointed Chancellor in January 1933 by President Hindenburg, who believed he could be controlled and managed. Within 18 months, Hitler had abolished all other parties, merged the offices of President and Chancellor, taken control of the press and judiciary, and begun the systematic persecution of Jews with the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 was the full dress rehearsal for the World War that was coming. Hitler and Mussolini sent forces to support Franco's nationalists. Stalin sent advisors and equipment to the Republicans. Britain and France maintained a policy of non-intervention that effectively ensured nationalist victory. The Nazi Condor Legion's bombing of the Basque town of Guernica on a market day in 1937, killing hundreds of civilians, became the century's iconic image of war's horror, immortalized in Picasso's painting. Franco took Madrid in April 1939. 5 months later, Hitler invaded Poland. The rehearsal was over. End of part 13.